Once we've collected input from the user, we're going to want to process that in some fashion and then output our results. Let's talk about output so that we can start to see how these items go together. And then the last item we'll discuss in the next lecture involves how do we process data on a basic level. So output in our case is going to involve outputting the data to a pop-up window, and most of the output that we utilize this semester is going to be in plain basic text. We're going to take some text in from the user, modify it in some manner, and then show the user some text in response that has some type of result of that processing. So we are going to be seeing a lot of output that either appears in Windows pop-ups. Later on, we'll look at how some of this output can be utilized in a terminal environment. So Visual Logic actually has its own console, and if you're not familiar with that term, it's basically, if you've ever seen a Linux distribution or you've worked with DOS or the PowerShell terminal, it has an environment that looks like that. We mostly work with that in those types of environments in entry-level programming courses because actually getting into graphical user interface programming, it can be a lot of work and it can get in the way of trying to understand the fundamental aspects that we want to cover this semester. So later on in some other courses, we'll get into GUI programming. But for now, what you want to know is that most of the stuff that we do this semester is going to involve collecting text via pop-ups or the console and printing text back out to the user via pop-ups or the console. And it's going to be really important that when we do output our text, that we focus on doing so and formatting the text in a way that's friendly to the user and easy to understand. One additional thing that we'll need to understand is that we're going to be using a process called concatenation. This is the process of basically gluing things together to produce textual output. So we're going to create sentences by gluing parts of sentences together. Kind of like you take Legos and you put them together and you make really big, cool things. We're going to take input from the user, some strings that we write ourselves, and some sentences that we write ourselves, words that we write ourselves, some processed data, and we're going to glue it all together to get some type of output. And so concatenation is the name for this process of creating output from different pieces within our program. And so in the initial programming environment that we use this semester, Visual Logic, the concatenation operator is the ampersand. And we're going to use the ampersand as kind of the mortar that's going to glue each piece of our sentence together. And we'll see how that works in a second. So here's what it looks like. This is not real programming code, although it looks somewhat like a mix-up of Python and JavaScript maybe. This is just me writing some fake mock code to help demonstrate some of the concepts that we've talked about. We're actually not going to see any programming code that looks like this until later in the semester when we get to Python. But for now, I just kind of wanted to demonstrate the concept in something that probably, if you've ever seen a program, would look more like this than the visual environment that we're using first. So the first line, you'll see that I'm taking the value JSON and I'm storing it into a variable called username. On the next line, I'm taking the number 75, I'm storing it in a variable called temp. And then on the third line, I'm actually gluing all these pieces together to make a sentence that is user-friendly. So I'm going to take the word hello plus a space. I'm going to glue it to the value stored in the username variable. I'm going to glue that to a period, a space, the words it is, and a space. And then I'm going to glue that to what's stored in the variable temp. And then I'm going to glue that to the words, contained in the next set of double quotes, degrees today. So after I glue all of these things together, these 3 lines of programming code would produce the output, hello JSON, it is 75 degrees today. The idea here is that we are gluing all these pieces together so that we end up with a sentence that's customized. And I could change the name, I could change the temperature. In this specific example, I am putting in a literal value for my name and the temperature, which means I am hard coding it or typing it directly into my program. But there's nothing that stops us from asking the user to enter their name and the current temperature, or going and getting the current temperature from a website or some third-party resource. So let's see how something that's written in this mock code will translate over to our tool Visual Logic. Back in my program, what I've got already is my input block. And just as a reminder, my input block has a variable called name. That is the box with the label name on it that I'm going to use to store what the user enters. After the user enters the variable, I want to go ahead and I want to add an output block. And what we're going to do is make this really simple. We're going to take the word hello, and we're going to take that word and we're going to concatenate it with the value that the user entered, which is stored in name. And if we look at this program, a couple things are going to be of interest. Notice that I'm using the ampersand between the word hello and the variable name. And what this does is glues the two things together. Notice I have to put a space in here, right? Space is actually a character. I think we get fooled into thinking that it's not because it's invisible. But anytime we want a space, we have to explicitly put that into our string. And one of the things you'll note as well is that hello has double quotes around it, but notice that name doesn't. This is how the programming environment can tell the difference between words that are intended for the human and a box with a label on it that contains a value that it needs to pull out and use in this expression. We'll talk more about double quoting and not double quoting words and variables in the processing lecture. So for now, though, please note that we need to make sure that anything that's intended for the eyes of the human being running the program is contained in double quotes, and that any variable that we're going to use to store a value in will not have double quotes around it, although the things we put in that variable may have double quotes around it. So let's see how this runs. All right, we're going to start at begin, go through input, go down through output, and we should see something printed to us. So, starts out, please enter your name. For now, I'm going to put my name in here, and again, remember, I need to use double quotes. And double quotes, again, indicate that this is a word that's coming from the user. It's very important. Hit OK, and then I get some output, and you will note that my output, these windows get tiny and they're hard to move, says hello space JSON. Well, why is that? Because here's hello space and double quotes, and the value that I entered that was stored in this variable or in this box was JSON, and this programming block went in and got that value and printed it out to the user. This is a really neat approach to building customized output for our users. You may be wondering, hey, what if I wanted to put an exclamation point because I'm happy? Well, we'd have to add it. So we would use another concatenation operator and then put a string in with an exclamation point. So you have to be this specific when writing a program. You cannot leave anything out or assume that the program will do anything for you. And there's my updated output with the exclamation point.